Welcome to Business Talk. We're here to chat with entrepreneurs and professionals ranging across different topics. And today's talk is on communication and business as part of our series called What the Talk. Today, I'm joined by Tammy Elliott, a people and organizational enabler and the CEO of Synergetic Workplaces Consulting. She has over 20 years of being in the trenches of human resources and change management functions. And joining Tammy is one of our experts on communication and the power of the subconscious mind, Dr. Dalton Kehoe, an entrepreneur with his company Communicate for Life. You can learn more about our guests in the description below. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Allow me to kick things off with the discussion here, with the fact that we're all underway with people coming back into the office. And Tammy, as an HR and change management consultant, what's unique about having you on is that you have a bird's eye view across many industries and businesses at any given time. So I want to take the opportunity to go back in time and tell me a little bit about what the climate was like before the pandemic for many of your clients.
So the climate was really business as usual. Get things done, have people in the office, moving things forward. It was what we would have considered at the time the normal, which I'm not sure is going to be our new normal as we move forward. So different industries, again, required people to show up in the office, to do work, to get that work done. And it was very, I would say, hectic. It was very North American, get the work done and move us forward.
What's the climate now? How's that changed?
It's such a huge difference. I think the pandemic was such a disruptor to business, and not only business, employees also, and management leadership. When I think about some of the challenges that my clients have gone through during the pandemic, needing to contemplate having a workforce that is no longer in the building, needing to figure out how they're going to deliver services in ways that they hadn't delivered them before. It was, the only word I can use is disruption, a substantive disruption in how leadership looked at the workplace, how employees looked at the workplace, and the impacts of in different industries. So some industries, you could transition people to a completely remote workplace. Other industries, you couldn't because of the nature of the work that's being done. In social services work, there's still the need to provide support to individuals. Some of my clients work in that field, and the violence against women field, how they then transition to a hybrid workforce. So some people were working from home. Some people were working actually at the shelter. It's a very different perspective. And I think it's led leaders to look differently and maybe think differently about how work can be done. There's also the trust aspect of employees that I think is in some instances been proven that employees can actually do work from home remotely, and they actually maybe can be more productive than if they're in an office environment. Sometimes leadership doesn't trust if you don't see people, and then you don't know what they're actually doing. And so I've seen instances where that's the case. And it's been very interesting to see how things are unfolding now with us moving forward into, I want to say, not necessarily coming out of the pandemic, but transitioning into a new normal of what does it really look like for the workplace? What does it mean? What does it mean for employees? What does it mean for their contracts? All these questions are very interesting as they unfold moving ahead.
Tammy, can I ask you a question about face-to-face communication?
Sure, absolutely.
When you're talking about trust, I mean, the power of the adaptive unconscious mind is that it reads every situation we're in and allows us to talk appropriately in those situations, right? And we do this pretty much automatically. And do you see more during this pandemic time? Do you see more of what I call control talk? That is, you're telling people to do things rather than asking them or engaging them in the process of accepting what to do?
It's a very, very pertinent question, Dalton. So I'm lucky to spend time with senior leaders in organizations and managers in organizations. And some of them have shifted to more of a directive communication style, whereas others are really focusing on that notion of still being collaborative, still being engaging, pushing out factual information so that people feel like they're engaged and appropriately getting what they need. But decision making is done in a still a collaborative fashion. But I've seen the spectrum. Like I've seen people who are just sending out information and saying, this is what you need to be doing. And the amount of meeting time has increased for some people. So now we're spending 8 hours a day on Zoom or on a video conferencing in meetings. Whereas if I was in the office, I may not have had that amount of time, right? In some industry, in some areas, which I find interesting. Then there's the other extreme, which is there's some companies that have said, you know what, we're not going to do meetings on particular days or after a certain point in time because the amount of time people are on video is really challenging. And how do you get your work done if you're constantly in meeting after meeting after meeting? So it's interesting that the range of decision making and the range of communication and collaboration, it really depends. Like I said, I've had the pleasure to work with some very good executive directors who engage appropriately around those things. And I've also had the not pleasure of working with some other folks who, unfortunately, they don't take that kind of perspective. And I think it's isolating for employees.
The people who engage people are still using the positive, connective talk that they have always used. And the people who don't use this effectively are still telling people what to do, giving them orders, etc.
I think that's part of it, but I also think that the people that are good at the engagement understand or have been, from what I've seen, they actually take a tact of, even though you're using technology, to still try and engage people in a way that they can be engaged. So you have to meet people from a communication perspective where they are. And so if that means having a telephone call or having a video call or asking somebody their opinion, they're doing that, but they're more conscious around how the other person is going to engage that communication component. These are strong leaders in organizations, solid leaders that know the value of that and the value of keeping their workforces engaged and moving forward. And some of them have actually shifted from less communication to more, which I think is really positive.
Excellent. Yeah, I think so too. Because the great thing is that, you know, COVID has a way of grinding down your sense of what's positive in any situation, right? Because there's always this edginess that comes into the mind in terms of the disease itself. And I think that contributes to people more likely being able to use control talk, which I think is basically telling people what to do, keeping them at a distance. And that undermines the engagement that workers actually have in the workplace. You're telling me that your folks don't do that very much. Is that right?
Well, I would suggest that there is a range. So the people that have done that before, and I see it, not necessarily with my clients, but with colleagues who work in different organizations, or colleagues and friends who work in different organizations, where they might get a directive. So for example, somebody that I know works at an organization where initially they were all remote. You're going to all work from home? Absolutely. And then a new manager starts and suddenly everyone has to be in the office 1 day a week for communication purposes. And that continues throughout with no discussion, no specific as to, is this valuable, is it not? And this organization, in my opinion, tends to be a control type of organization where they schedule meetings, they direct staff more than engage them around the aspects. And so I think it really does depend. I think that some organizations have learned from COVID a way to move forward where you can engage staff better. Yeah. I think that that's been eye-opening. I think other organizations continue as they continue doing what they've been doing for years, thinking it works really well when, you know, their turnover might be high. They have difficulty attracting and retaining staff. Yeah. Like, you know, even though they claim the culture is good, the culture is, let me tell you how to do it, not what do you think? How can you make it better and improve it? Which is a challenge, right? So,
well, when you're talking about engaging, of course, you are talking about my favorite kind of talk. I divide the world of talk into three types, right? Which is control talk. You tell people what to do, and then connect talk, which is you ask, you smile, you use warmth in your voice in order to get them engaged with you in the process of doing it. And there's also dialogue talk too, which is the most complicated form of talk we have, which is where we learn to take a breath in difficult situations, ask questions, really listen, and respond openly and without judgment. And it seems to me like are you in an organization that meets those last criteria?
So I think that some of my clients, the organizations that they run, are unique in that fact that they do meet that criteria. But it's a new thing for me, having transitioned from working with larger organizations that are very structured to smaller organizations that actually tend to put relationship and those pieces forward as really important to work through. I've seen some really skilled leaders be able to have some really difficult conversations, which would never work in a corporate environment, would never work with some of the clients that the other clients I deal with. Sure. And because I have a range of clients that I work with, it's interesting to work with those individuals because I think that they do bring a different sort of value to the organization, and they engage people in a way that makes them want to move ahead and makes them there's a higher trust level, there's a higher commitment level to the organization. It could be values driven. It may not be. It's just really interesting to see that span of how different those leaders communicate. Sure. As opposed to, you're going to do this and this is how it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, I think when we speak in generalities like value driven and things like that, that generally covers the ground. But I think it also has to do with the ability of individual leaders to speak in a way that connects with people on a moment-to-moment basis, right? And that turns out to lay the groundwork for the best kinds of values.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing is that I've been working through with a few clients around some realignment of resourcing in their organizations. And I think that it's very interesting for them to think through. It's a different process. It's not a knee-jerk, we just need to fix this and have it go this way. It's thoughtful. It's actually trying to understand what's going to best make the organization sustainable. Whereas other folks are just like, let's just get it done. And I don't care. I just want it done and I want it done yesterday. It's just a different approach from a leadership perspective. It's a different approach from a communication perspective. Yeah. It's about thinking about how the staff are going to absorb the information, how they're going to process it, what information to tell people when, to make sure that they're comfortable. It's a real pleasure to work with those types of clients that are so thoughtful, as opposed to some of the other clients I work with that are in, I would say, more traditional environments where
control environments.
Absolutely, which is so different, right? The work is different, the approach is different. Yeah. It's a quite interesting. It's quite interesting for me. I have to shift gears when I'm dealing with one of the clients to another one.
I want to take a moment here to get some commentary on is the fact that regardless, at the moment you do decide to go in the office, there are rules that never used to exist before. This is
Mhm.
how you meet people. This is actually how you have to dress in the context of you have to wear a mask, perhaps. There are there are rules and regulations that never used to exist that need to now be forced in the workplace when you're meeting face to face. And so, are you noticing that, Tammy? That how are employees reacting to that? Do they feel that there's enough of that? Are some feeling that there's too much of that? And Dalton, as Tammy kind of comments on that, just trying to think about, it's just that it seems like control talk is inevitable, at least in that respect.
It's really interesting that you bring that point up. So the notion of protecting individuals and your clients, yourself, and your colleagues is a really significant conversation that's happening right now in a lot of different environments. So I'm a bit of a legal geek in employment law. And so there's been cases around if employees do or don't follow policies, and they could be fired for not following the policy, and is that appropriate or not, which is really interesting. You've got employees that are very much concerned about their own health and well-being and the health and well-being of individuals they have to meet with, so they are happy to have the PPE, the extra sanitary measures that are in place. And they are very thankful that employers are actually taking that tack and being very appropriate. And then in the same environment, I had a client who had an individual when things started to move forward and vaccinations were happening, where she recalled people back to the office. So she had sent some folks home to work and started to recall on a not a continuous basis, but like every other week or so. And the response from one employee was that she quit because she did not want to necessarily have to go back into the office. Was that because of the need or exposure to actual potential health risks? Was it because she felt comfortable working at home? Was it because there wasn't confidence that she would be safe? I'm not, I can't attribute the specifics because I don't know. But we see this happening. We also see in the restaurant industry, for example, there's a lot of attempt to hire staff right now. And those staff are saying, no, we don't want to work in this industry. We don't want to be paid a limited amount of money and have that risk of potentially getting sick, which is interesting because you're right. There is this requirement, and it's not a requirement. It's a law. It's a requirement by, there's very little ability for employers to not move ahead with appropriate safety protocols. They need to do that. And that's for the protection of everyone involved.
Dalton, I want to get Dalton's perspective on that. How do you balance that? Because this is a new level of control talk that is almost necessary in the workplace, and sometimes it's expected expected by employees that the workplace is going to enforce it, and others that really don't like this new control talk that they never had experience before.
Well, I think basically what has to happen here is that there are two ways of telling people what to do. The first way is the classic control way, which is just do it. Right? The second way is, here's what needs to be done. We're in this common situation, so can we work together and get this thing done? Now, the second way is much more connected. The first way is direct control. Tammy was talking about it in lots of organizations. And I think that if you take the word control and you put it into a dialogical form, that is, you are listening to what's going on in the situation, and then you speak as if you're paying attention, you use the words that are much more likely to get people to do the work without giving an order. That is, you actually say, this is what needs to be done. I think we can do this. Can we do this the next day or two or a week or two or whatever it is? And people will actually do it because they don't feel commanded. And
they feel heard. to there,
Yeah,
then be
they
open
feel heard.
to an
That's,
alternative way of going outside of their comfort zone for the sake
that,
of contributing and winning together.
that's right.
So
That's exactly right.
the only challenge I see, Dalton, is that, and this is where I think about the healthcare industry and I think about the social service industry, where, for example, the Ministry of Children and Social Services has mandated that you have to use these protocols. You
Sure.
have to do these things. And it's not the employer that's actually influencing the control, it's the government,
I
right?
agree. But if you're telling somebody they have to do these things, wouldn't it be better to say, do this? Or, we have a new mandate out from the government that says these things have to be done. Do you think we can do them now? Do you think we can do them soon? Do you think we can do them today? When you ask questions while you're giving out commands, people are suddenly engaged in a way they wouldn't be if you just said, do it.
Oh, I agree with the engagement. I still think there's a level of control that there isn't as much wiggle room around when they can deal with those things, about how that they can specifically approach it. Some of the policies I've seen that have come out have indicated, like, this is how this must be done in order to ensure the safety of everyone. How the leader communicates around that from the government could be, look, we all know it's important to be mindful of each other's safety and security. Some of these things are going to seem maybe a little bit over the top, but frankly, we're all trying to work towards a positive workplace and a positive environment.
That's what I call connective dialogue, right? Because then you're using both the emotions of connection, and you're using an open form of speech that's built upon not only describing what's going on, but also encouraging people to respond appropriately. That's not the same thing as giving an order. Not the same thing as saying the government says we have to do it, so just do it, right? That won't get you much commitment. But the way you've described it is a perfect way to get people's commitment to be active in the process, in the moment.
Yeah, it's very interesting to have seen over the pandemic, because part of the role that I provide support in is around policy development to some clients. So I see this information coming out, and then it may be a very stepped communication approach. But again, how the leader communicates that and how it's positioned in the organization makes or breaks kind of the acceptance of it. Because, culture will trump strategy and policy every time. So if you haven't positioned it appropriately, or people are not accepting, then it becomes a significant barrier to the ability to actually implement what needs to be done, right? Even from a communications perspective.
Absolutely.
And I have seen organizations fail because of the fact that they have not communicated or thought about, how are people actually going to receive this message? How is it going to be heard? What do people need to hear and understand? And are we giving them too much information, too little information? Those questions don't seem to cross the minds of some leaders, which is so unfortunate.
I agree. That's because they have a strictly control orientation. I have the job. I am the leader. I tell you what to do. Not very useful from a communication point of view.
Yeah, and those organizations, I think, are ones that I still marvel at the fact that they can have leadership that is successful, kind of in spite of themselves.
Yeah, really. Don't you think?
Because I don't understand. Like, that's not an organization I would want to work in, and that's not an organization I would want to support. I think that it's challenging for individuals in that type of environment, and it gets frustrating. And again, they have high turnover and challenges retaining people, and it's such an interesting. It'll be interesting to see how those environments continue to evolve based on the pandemic and how we move forward. So would they even consider a hybrid work environment where employees could work sometime at home, sometime at the office? The organization I mentioned earlier is saying as of a certain date, everyone is going to be in the office full time.
Yeah.
And that's, to me, again, that's really interesting. So you're telling everyone this, and you're not taking into consideration how much benefit there has been for having employees actually work from home and cut out commutes and have, different ways to engage and have more rest and
It's
slow down.
interesting you mentioned that, Tammy. I guess, is there something behind this lack of realization that there has been a benefit? Because the question I would ask you then is, when you get hired as a consultant for some of these companies, like say manufacturing, perhaps, what measurements of success, what instruments of measurement are you putting in place to show either the success or failure of a certain tactic within your work? Perhaps with these individuals or these leaders, there was never a baseline set pre-pandemic. So maybe they weren't even perhaps measuring anything, and so therefore can't speak or realize that there was a benefit, and a hybrid approach maybe would make more sense. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I think that you've hit on something that I think is interesting, is that some organizations, particularly in the manufacturing fields, they tend to have dollars be the only measurement aspect, right? So they tend to, are we making money? Are we not making money? What are the hard, cold amount of costs associated with doing business, as opposed to necessarily dealing with the people side of the business? There tends to be a little more rigor around those pieces, often because in manufacturing environments, unless you get really highly skilled individuals that you need to attract from a labor perspective, there's more folks available, right, to be able to come and do the work that's required. And those folks don't necessarily need to be paid at a really high level. So the amount of labor available to you can be higher. So this is what I've seen in the industry pre-pandemic. So I don't need to necessarily consider the challenges associated with those individuals. I don't need to consider paying them at a higher rate. I don't need to consider the aspects, because there's always more. There's always more folks that will come and take those jobs and can do that work because it's not as highly skilled. And so it plays in interestingly into creating a differential in culture between those folks that are actually doing the manufacturing versus those that are actually doing the strategy, the administration of the business. It is really interesting to see too how the pandemic has impacted the manufacturing industry. So I do know of someone who needed to, during the pandemic, go to work because they're in a manufacturing environment. So it's not like you can work from home, because you need to actually be there to pack up the product that's been manufactured so it can be shipped out. But what this employer was open to do, which I think is beneficial, is the employee that I know ended up shifting their work hours because they needed to take public transit in order to get into their work. And public transit we had challenges around how many people are in buses and how often they get to the workplace. And they were open at the employee's request to say, I'm just going to shift my hours. So I'm going to come in earlier and leave earlier so I can avoid the large crowds that happen. And that employer was in a good position to be able to say, yeah, not a problem. And that is an engagement that I think is appropriate in a manufacturing environment. So not just looking at, we have to have a shift that's from this time to this time. If they have the flexibility to do that, will that continue? I hope in that environment for those employees that consideration continues. Will it go back now that things are lifting? I think it really depends on how the employer looks at their employees and how they want to engage that workplace and the workforce. Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. I think that's totally fair. And it sounds like on an industry by industry basis, the the instrument of measurement either is super simple or becomes more complex. And depending on that dynamic, there are different tactics in play in how employees need to do their work to drive revenue at the end of the day. So that's interesting. It's good to also hear that, even in those very simplistic models of measurement for those industries, some of them are taken into consideration that the health of their employees, although they do need to be in the office or in the manufacturing space to deliver, they realize that if everybody got sick, that revenue number is going to be definitely impacted. So they are making some changes on start and end times to ensure that they're not exposed to a large enough sample of the population on the bus ride to work, and hopefully mitigate the risk of people just ultimately the entire workforce getting sick and they're out for a week or two. That could mean millions of dollars lost. So it's an interesting thing to think about for sure.
Yeah, I think the other component piece we've seen in manufacturing, like if you think about where the outbreaks have been and employers that haven't put into place appropriate measures around things like spacing and having not enough, like having too many people in a particular location at one time. We saw those huge outbreaks that happened early in the pandemic. And I'm hopeful that a number of employers are learning from those aspects. Like we saw the Amazon plant or the Amazon location being shut down not far from us in Mississauga. There's been a lot of outbreaks at processing plants in Brampton and those places. And so one of the other pieces that this particular employer, which I think is a good employer, they set up appropriate spacing so that employees could have enough space to have their own pocket where they didn't have to wear a mask necessarily because they were so much farther away from another employee that they could have their own little spot to work and do work, which again impacts dramatically the ability for work to get done. If you think of assembly line plants versus other organizations, right? Very different, very, very different approach. And I think that there are companies that are really concerned and value the human resources they have. And then there are others that unfortunately don't have the same perspective. And I think that drives some of the business decision making that happens in these organizations, rightly or wrongly, right?
Fair enough. But I want to roll out the red carpet to you and Dalton as a thank you for joining this conversation now that we've reached the end of our time. Dalton, what do you have going on? Whatever is on your mind, whatever you'd like to plug with the listeners today.
I'm actually not going to plug very much today, except that I want to communicate to Tammy and everyone who's going to pay attention to this, that they need to go to my website, CommunicateforLife.ca. You'll find a series of books there that I've written, management books and personal communication books, as well as a short course and a long course on how you actually carry out effectively engaging communication every day with your staff. And I think if you go to CommunicateforLife.ca, you're going to find lots of valuable elements there that you can take advantage of as a manager.
That's
Again,
great.
thank you very much, guys.
You got it. And Tammy, for you, anything you'd like to plug, or any advice you'd like to give to your fellow peers in the industry?
I think the thing that's important is to recognize that we are in a state of change right now. And I think that as we move ahead, we just have to be open and communicate, as Dalton says, in a positive way. So leverage the resources that he mentioned and keep ourselves moving ahead in a creative and positive way, and be as resilient as you can, because unfortunately we're not quite at the end yet.
Fair enough. Well, thank you both. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks.